The auctioneer's gavel fell with a crack that echoed like a gunshot in the silent, opulent hall of Sotheby's. All I could see were the faces of my son Ben and his wife Sarah, contorted in masks of pure, unadulterated shock. Their lavish world was crumbling live on international television, and they had absolutely no one to blame but themselves. They thought they had buried me. Another dusty chapter of history. They forgot that historians are the ones who write the final account. It all began 3 months earlier on a perfectly ordinary Sunday. Ben and Sarah arrived at my home, their smiles as bright and hollow as new coins. They brought a ridiculously expensive bottle of wine, a classic opening gambit for a difficult conversation. I had lived long enough to know that grand gestures often precede terrible news. I greeted them warmly, though, playing the part of the doting, slightly oblivious father they expected me to be. Laura would have seen through them in a heartbeat. After some excruciatingly banal small talk about their new Tesla and a planned trip to Bali, Ben cleared his throat. "Dad, we have been worried about you rattling around in this big old house alone." He said it with such practiced sincerity. Sarah placed a cool hand on my arm. "So we found a wonderful place for you, Michael. A community, with people your own age." The words hung in the air, clinical and suffocating. They weren't offering a suggestion. They were delivering a verdict. The place, as they called it, was a facility named Golden Meadows. The brochure they produced showed smiling seniors playing shuffleboard, but the reality was a sterile, beige building that smelled of antiseptic and despair. It was a place where memories went to fade under fluorescent lights, a clean, efficient warehouse for the elderly. They spoke of its top-tier medical care and security, but all I saw were the locked gates. It was a prison disguised as a sanctuary. "It's for your own good, Dad," Ben insisted, his voice taking on the patient tone one uses with a difficult child. "We can't be here all the time, and the upkeep on the house is a fortune. This way, you will be safe, and we won't have to worry." Their worry, I noted, was not for my happiness or my connection to the home I shared with Laura for 50 years, but for their own convenience and financial burden. They saw my life as a line item on their budget. Then came the final, brutal blow. As I sat there, trying to process my eviction, Sarah added with chilling pragmatism, "And to make this all financially viable, we are going to have to sell the house and its contents. We have already spoken to an estate agent. It will be a clean sweep. A clean sweep." That's what she called the erasure of my entire existence, the liquidation of a lifetime of collected memories, books, and treasures, each with a story only I knew. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, a glacial anger that was far more potent than any hot rage. I thought of Laura, of her laughter echoing in these halls, of the spot on the sofa where she read for hours. This house was a living monument to our love, and they were planning to gut it and sell it for parts. In that moment, I felt her presence beside me, not as a ghost, but as a compass. Her memory demanded that I not let them win. I looked at my son. "Ben," I began, my voice quiet, "some of these things, your mother's things." He cut me off immediately, waving a dismissive hand. "It's just stuff, Dad. We have to be practical. Sentimentality doesn't pay the bills." The callousness of it stole my breath. To him, Laura's cherished piano was just a bulky piece of furniture. My library, a collection of dusty fire hazards. He saw no value in anything that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. They had it all planned. The movers would come on Friday. The estate sale would be the following weekend. My room at Golden Meadows was already paid for. There was no room for negotiation. This was not a discussion. It was a hostile takeover of my life, orchestrated by my own flesh and blood. They looked at me, expecting a fight, tears, the futile outbursts from a confused old man. They were about to be very disappointed. I simply nodded. I stood up, walked to the front door, and held it open for them. "I will be ready on Friday," I said, my voice betraying no emotion. As they walked to their car, triumphant and relieved, I took one last, long look around my home. I wasn't just looking at the furniture or the paintings. I was mapping a battlefield. The war had been declared, and I, a student of history's greatest strategists, was already planning my campaign. When they dropped me at my new room at Golden Meadows, a space the size of my old walk-in closet, they were visibly unnerved by my calm demeanor. I smiled a thin, placid smile that did not reach my eyes. "This will be fine," I told them, as I surveyed the bare walls and the single sad window overlooking a parking lot. My composure was a weapon they didn't understand. They expected a storm, but I gave them a chilling, silent frost. "Thank you for taking care of everything," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Whatever you think is best." Relief washed over their faces. They had their victory. They kissed my cheek, promised to visit soon, a lie we all acknowledged, and left to begin the dismantling of my life. The moment the door clicked shut, the smile dropped from my face. It was time to get to work. I had 2 weeks. In the sterile silence of my new cell, my mind, the one they dismissed as full of useless dates and dead kings, became my fortress and my armory. For decades, I had taught my students that history is a weapon. It teaches one to see patterns, to understand motivations, and to exploit the arrogance of those who believe they are in control. Ben and Sarah were fatally arrogant. They had underestimated their opponent, a classic and costly historical blunder. My entire plan hinged on one item, an object they would consider utterly worthless. It was not a painting, nor was it a piece of antique furniture. It was a book, a tattered 18th century edition of Julius Caesar's The Gallic Wars, in the original Latin. It had sat on the bottom shelf of my study for decades, its leather spine cracked, and its pages yellowed. To a casual observer, it was junk. To me, it was everything. For hidden within a cleverly hollowed-out section in the back of that book lay a family secret. It was a letter, penned and signed by General George Washington himself, addressed to my great-great-great-grandfather, a Captain Thaddeus Finch, commending him for bravery at the Battle of Trenton. It was more than a family heirloom. It was a museum-quality artifact of incalculable historical significance and monetary value, a value my children could never comprehend. I had never told them about it. How could I? Explaining its historical importance would have been met with blank stares. But if I had ever hinted at its monetary worth, their greed would have been insatiable. They would have seen it only as a lottery ticket, a thing to be sold immediately to fund another vacation or a bigger car. They were incapable of understanding that some things have a value that transcends money. This was their critical weakness, but I could not execute this plan alone. I needed a trusted lieutenant, someone with specific expertise and unquestionable loyalty. My mind immediately went to Dr. Alistair Finch. He had been my most brilliant graduate student 20 years ago, a young man with a passion for history that matched my own. Now, he was a senior specialist in Americana and historical documents. At Sotheby's, no less. I picked up the phone. "Professor." His voice boomed over the line, as warm and respectful as if I had just seen him yesterday. "What an honor. To what do I owe the pleasure?" I took a deep breath and began to tell him my story. I laid out the whole sordid affair, the nursing home, my children's betrayal, the impending estate sale, and their complete ignorance of the true treasure hidden amongst the dross. I did not have to embellish. The plain facts were damning enough. It was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Alistair finally spoke, his voice was thick with a controlled fury. "That is monstrous, Professor. Absolutely monstrous. It is an act of cultural vandalism, let alone familial cruelty. Consider me at your service. Whatever you need, whenever you need it, I am your man." In that moment, I knew I had a formidable ally. My solitary campaign had just gained its cavalry. Together, over several hushed phone calls, we forged the plan. Alistair's knowledge of the auction world was invaluable. He knew exactly how to handle an artifact of this magnitude. The plan was twofold. First, I had to retrieve the book from the estate sale without arousing suspicion. Second, Alistair would begin laying the groundwork to have the letter authenticated and prepared for a major televised auction. We would turn their greedy little sale into our grand stage. The week leading up to the sale was torture. My kind old neighbor, Mrs. Gable, called me each evening with a pained report. They had a huge dumpster in the driveway, Michael. They're just throwing things out. Photo albums, your old papers from the university. I listened, my heart of cold, heavy stone in my chest. Each item they discarded was a piece of my history, of Laura's history. But I told myself to endure. The final accounting would be worth the pain. The worst blow came on Wednesday. They sold your wife's piano, she whispered, her voice cracking. Some young couple bought it for $200. They just wanted it for their daughter to learn on. Laura's beautiful baby grand, the instrument that had filled our home with music for half a century, sold for less than the price of a dinner in one of Ben's fancy restaurants. I closed my eyes, picturing Laura's hands on the keys, and hardened my heart. Then they sold my library. Not to a collector or even a used bookstore, but to a man who bought books by the yard to fill the shelves of model homes. He paid them a flat $500 for a collection of first editions that Alastair later estimated was worth at least $50,000. Ben's ignorance was not just insulting, it was financially catastrophic for him. He was burning a fortune, completely unaware of the real fire he was stoking. Each piece of news was a fresh wound, but it did not weaken my resolve. It tempered it, turning it from brittle anger into forged steel. This was no longer just about reclaiming an artifact. It was about preserving a legacy. It was about delivering a lesson in value, history, and respect that was decades overdue. My revenge would not be loud or violent. It would be precise, academic, and utterly devastating. It would be a history lesson they would never forget. Alastair arranged everything for the day of the sale. He sent a package to me at Golden Meadows via a discreet courier. Inside was my disguise, a tweed flat cap, a pair of thick, non-prescription glasses that altered the shape of my eyes, a shabby overcoat, and a walking cane. I practiced my new persona in the small mirror, a slightly stooped, shuffling academic, easily overlooked. I would be a ghost at my own funeral. A car service, also arranged by Alastair, picked me up on Saturday morning. The driver, a professional who asked no questions, drove me to my old neighborhood. Seeing the familiar streets filled me with a profound sadness. I was returning to my own home not as its master, but as an infiltrator, an exile sneaking back across the border into his own occupied country. My objective was simple: retrieve the package and get out. The street was a circus. Cars were parked haphazardly on lawns, and a garish, professionally printed sign on my front yard read, "Huge estate sale. Everything must go." The front door, Laura's favorite shade of blue, was propped wide open. Strangers streamed in and out, carrying pieces of my life in their arms. My home, my sanctuary, had been turned into a cheap flea market. It felt like a profound violation, and my grief warred with a cold, focused anger. I pulled the cap down low and hobbled towards the entrance, leaning heavily on the cane. I moved through the rooms of my house, my heart aching with every step. I saw a woman haggling over Laura's favorite armchair. I saw a man thumbing through my old vinyl records. They were vultures picking at the corpse of a life, oblivious to the soul that had once inhabited it. I kept my head down and pushed on towards my objective, the study, and then I saw them. Ben and Sarah were standing in the dining room holding court. They were laughing, accepting cash, looking utterly thrilled with themselves. "This isn't a funeral," Ben was saying to a neighbor. "It's a celebration of a new chapter. For us and for him." He gestured vaguely in the direction of the nursing home. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. They were not mourning a loss. They were celebrating a windfall. Seeing them so pleased with their treachery erased my last pangs of doubt or sentimentality. This was not a family matter anymore. It was a strategic operation. I was a historian, and they were my subjects, a case study in avarice and disrespect. I felt a sense of detached purpose settle over me. There would be no mercy. I slipped past them, just another anonymous old man in the crowd, and made my way down the hall. The study, my sanctuary for so many years, was in chaos. Books were pulled from shelves, papers were strewn about, and my old mahogany desk was covered in price tags. It was the heart of my home, and it had been ransacked. For a moment, a wave of pure despair washed over me. What if they had thrown it out? What if it was already gone? I took a steadying breath, reminding myself of the mission. My magnificent collection of books, my friends and companions for a lifetime, had been reduced to pathetic cardboard boxes. One was labeled History, $10 each. Another, Fiction, 3 for $5. And then I saw the one that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a large box in the corner, filled with the oldest, most worn-out volumes. A sloppy, handwritten sign on its side read, Misc Old Books, $5 a box. My eyes, magnified by the thick glasses, scanned the spines frantically. My scholarly calm evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal fear. What if my calculation was wrong? What if, in a fluke of tidiness, they had simply tossed the most decrepit-looking books in the dumpster? My gaze darted from one cracked spine to another. My entire plan, my one shot at justice, rested on the contents of this single, pathetic cardboard box. And then I saw it. Tucked between a moldy farmer's almanac and a book of 19th century poetry, I saw the faded brown leather and the faint, worn gilt lettering. Si voli Caesaris, the Gallic Wars. It was there. It was safe. They had overlooked it, just as I knew they would. They had judged a book by its cover, and in doing so, had discarded a king's ransom. A wave of triumphant relief washed over me. My hand, trembling only slightly, reached into the box. I rummaged for a moment, feigning indecision, before pulling out 2 other worthless books, along with the Caesar. I adopted the persona of a casual browser, a man looking for a bit of cheap decoration. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The first and most critical part of my campaign was nearly complete. All that was left was to pay the dragon at the gate. I hobbled over to the cash table where Sarah was presiding, a smug queen surveying her conquered territory. "I have $5 for this box of books," I mumbled, my voice raspy and old. She barely looked at me, grabbing the bill from my hand. "Take them," she said with a dismissive wave. "Enjoy the reading." The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. She had just sold her children's multi-million-dollar birthright for the price of a cheap latte. Clutching my prize, I made my way out of the house without a backward glance. The weight of the box was both a physical and symbolic burden. Inside lay the key to my past and the instrument of their future ruin. As I stepped off the curb, I felt a profound sense of finality. I was no longer the owner of that home, only the curator of its most important secret. I had lost the battle for the house, but I was about to win the war. The anonymous car was waiting a block away, just as Alistair had promised. I got in, placed the box carefully on the seat beside me, and simply said, "To the drop point." The driver nodded. Half an hour later, I handed the box to another discreet courier in a quiet library parking lot. The book containing the Washington letter was on its way to New York, on its way to the experts, on its way to its grand debut on the world stage. The next few weeks were an exercise in patience, a virtue I had honed over 80 years. I played the part of the contented resident of Golden Meadows, eating my bland meals and participating in bingo nights with a placid smile. I was biding my time, a dormant volcano of retribution. Ben would call occasionally, his voice dripping with condescending pity. He'd ask if I was comfortable, if I was making friends, all while calculating the interest on his inheritance. "The estate sale went really well, Dad," he told me during one such call, his voice brimming with pride. "We cleared almost 60,000 after all the fees. Can you believe it?" I could. It was a pathetic sum, a pittance for a lifetime of carefully curated possessions. I congratulated him on his business acumen, my voice a perfect imitation of a proud, simple father. Let him savor his hollow little victory. The fall would be that much greater. Then came the call I had been waiting for. "It's done." Alistair's voice was electric with excitement. "The authentication is ironclad. We have a confirmed provenance that is beyond reproach, and I have secured it a prime spot in the fall Americana auction. It's going to be televised. I also took the liberty of sending a special invitation to Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Finch, lured them with the promise of high society networking. They took the bait immediately. The night of the auction was a symphony of quiet opulence. The arid Sotheby's hummed with money and anticipation. Gilt-framed masterpieces lined the walls, looking down on a crowd of collectors, investors, and socialites. It was a world Ben and Sarah desperately wanted to inhabit, a world of real power and legacy. They had no idea they were walking into their own public execution, and that I was the one who had signed the warrant. I saw them arrive from my discreet position in a private viewing box Alistair had arranged. Sarah was draped in a designer gown that cost more than Laura's piano, and Ben wore a tuxedo with the stiff ease of a man playing a role. They were beaming, networking, shaking hands with people they thought mattered, completely oblivious. They were actors on a stage, unaware that the final act of the play was their tragedy. I, on the other hand, was not in disguise. I wore my finest Savile Row suit, one I had saved for decades for a special occasion. My hair was perfectly styled, my shoes shined to a mirror finish. I was no longer the frail, shuffling old man from the estate sale. I was Professor Michael Finch, a man of substance and history, ready to reclaim his narrative. Tonight I was not a victim. I was a force of nature. The auction began. A Warhol sold. A Tiffany lamp fetched a small fortune. With each fall of a gavel, the atmosphere grew more charged. Ben and Sarah watched, enthralled by the spectacle of wealth. They would occasionally point and whisper, their eyes wide with aspiration. They saw the money, but they did not see the history or the artistry. To them, it was just a scoreboard, and they were desperate to be winning. And then the moment arrived. The auctioneer stepped forward. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special item. Lot 72. A recently discovered letter of immense historical importance, penned by the hand of our nation's first president. The room fell into a hushed silence. A high-definition image of the letter, with its elegant, faded script, appeared on the large screens. I glanced down at Ben and Sarah. They looked momentarily interested, but then Sarah leaned over and whispered something to Ben, and they both chuckled, probably making a joke about old paper. Ben pulled out his phone, likely checking his stock portfolio. Their arrogance was a shield that was about to be shattered into a million pieces. They could not conceive that this moment had anything to do with them. The auctioneer continued. This letter, from General George Washington to a Captain Thaddeus Finch, commending his bravery. At the name Finch, Ben looked up from his phone, a flicker of confusion on his face. He nudged Sarah. The camera zoomed in on the signature, a bold, unmistakable G. Washington. The bidding will start at $500,000, the auctioneer declared. A collective gasp went through the room. Ben's jaw went slack. 500,000? He mouthed to Sarah, who was now staring intently at the screen. The name, Finch, was echoing in their minds. The bidding began immediately, paddles shooting up across the room. 700,000, 900,000, 1 million. The numbers climbed with dizzying speed, each one a hammer blow against their smug certainty. Thaddeus Finch, Sarah whispered, her voice bestrained hiss. Wasn't that your grandmother's family name? Ben was white as a sheet, his eyes darting from the screen to the frantic bidders. He was finally connecting the dots, but his mind refused to accept the horrifying picture that was forming. 2 million, 2.5 million. The bidding was a furious battle between a phone bidder and a collector in the front row. The television cameras, sensing the extraordinary nature of the moment, panned across the excited crowd. For a moment, they focused on the shocked, pale faces of Ben and Sarah. They were the perfect picture of horrified disbelief, a dramatic subplot for the viewers at home. Their private nightmare was rapidly becoming a public spectacle, and the worst was yet to come. They were trapped in the spotlight of their own greed. Going once, going twice, sold for $3,200,000, the gavel fell with a final, deafening crack. The room exploded into applause. Ben looked like he was going to be physically sick. Sarah was clutching his arm, her knuckles white. Their minds were reeling with the impossible truth, a fortune, a family fortune they had literally sold for less than the price of a cardboard box. And a winning bidder, the auctioneer announced, his voice beaming, is a new philanthropic entity, the Finch Legacy Foundation. He paused for effect. Whose trustee is with us tonight? A spotlight flared to life, sweeping across the darkened room. It surged for a moment, then stopped, bathing my private box in a brilliant, unwavering light for all to see. Slowly, deliberately, I rose to my feet. I stepped out of the box and walked to the railing, looking down upon the stunned assembly. I did not smile. I simply stood there, a specter from the past they thought they had buried. From below, I could see my son's face. It was a canvas of utter, soul-shattering horror. The ghost of his father had returned, not as a pauper, but as a king. I made my way downstairs and onto the stage, accepting the offered microphone. As I walked, I passed their table. Ben couldn't meet my eyes. Sarah was openly weeping now, not tears of sadness, but tears of pure, frustrated greed. The sound was ugly and hollow. I looked directly at them for a single cold moment. I said nothing, but my eyes conveyed everything. The history lesson had begun. "Thank you," I began, my voice clear and strong, amplified throughout the silent hall. "My great-great-great-grandfather was a man of honor. He valued duty and legacy above all else. He passed this letter down through generations, not as a financial instrument, but as a reminder of what our family stood for. A reminder of the importance of preserving history. A reminder that true value cannot always be seen with the eyes." I then turned my gaze fully upon my children, and the cameras followed. Sadly, some people lose sight of this. They see heirlooms as burdens and history as junk to be liquidated. They will sell a lifetime of memories for a pittance, blind to the true treasures they cast aside in their haste. Let this be a lesson. Never, ever underestimate the value of the past. The room was silent, every single person understanding the brutal, public rebuke. It was too much for them. Ben shot to his feet, his face crimson with shame and rage. "Dad, you," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. But no words came out. He was undone. Sarah pulled him back down, burying her face in her hands, her sobs echoing in the microphone's feedback. Their lavish world had collapsed in on them, live, on camera, for the entire world to witness. Checkmate. 3 months later, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of my new penthouse apartment, looking down on the city lights. The space was minimalist, modern, but punctuated with a few key pieces from my old life. Things Alistair had helped me buy back. Laura's portrait had pride of place over the fireplace. It was not a house full of things, but a home full of meaning, a new beginning, built on the foundations of a vindicated past. My lawyer had just left. My new will was signed and sealed. The Finch Legacy Foundation, funded by the auction, was already in operation. Its first act was to endow the Laura Finch Chair of American History at my old university. My children, Ben and Sarah, were mentioned by name, but only to be explicitly and irrevocably disinherited. They had received their inheritance already, all 60,000 pieces of silver. The story of their public humiliation had become a minor legend in philanthropic circles. They were social pariahs, cautionary tales of greed and disrespect. They had the money from the house sale, but it was a pittance compared to what they had lost. More importantly, it was tainted money, a constant, bitter reminder of their monumental folly. They had flown too close to the sun on wings of arrogance and had been burned to ash. It was never about the money for me. The money was simply ammunition, a tool to achieve a greater purpose. It was the means by which I could reclaim my family's narrative and honor my wife's memory in a way that would last for generations. Unlike my children, I understood that wealth is not for hoarding or for spending on fleeting luxuries. It is for building, for preserving, for creating a legacy that outlives you. I often wondered what Laura would have thought of my elaborate revenge. She was a gentle soul and despised conflict, but she also had a fierce sense of justice and a deep reverence for our family's history. I believe she would have been saddened by our children's actions, but she would have understood my response. I had not destroyed our family. I had merely pruned its diseased branches to save the tree. My life now was richer than it had ever been. I guest lectured at the university, where bright young minds were eager to learn, not to inherit. I sat on the board of my foundation, directing funds to historical preservation projects. I was no longer a boring academic relic. I was a respected philanthropist, a living piece of history. I was valued for my mind and my experience, not for what I owned. This new life was the complete antithesis of the one my children had planned for me. They had sentenced me to a slow, quiet fade into irrelevance in a sterile room. Instead, I was more vibrant and engaged with the world than I had been in years. In trying to write my final chapter for me, they had inadvertently given me the freedom and the resources to write a far better one for myself. I felt no hatred for Ben and Sarah anymore, only a profound and weary pity. They lived in a flat, colorless world where everything had a price, but nothing had any value. Their punishment was not the loss of the money, but the hollowness of their own souls, a poverty no inheritance could ever cure. They would forever be haunted by the ghost of a treasure they were too blind to see. I picked up the framed photo of Laura from the mantel. Her smile was as warm and loving as I remembered. "I did it, my love," I whispered to the picture. "I saved our story." I knew she couldn't hear me, but in that quiet, peaceful room, surrounded by a legacy I had reclaimed from the ashes, I felt her approval. I felt her presence. And for the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. True inheritance, I realized, is not something you are given. It is something you earn the right to possess by understanding and respecting it. It is the wisdom of the past, the honor of your ancestors, the stories that shape you. My children saw their inheritance as a house and a bank account. I saw it as a letter from a hero and the love of a good woman, and in the end, that made all the difference. History, I have always taught, is a relentless and impartial judge. It has a long memory and an even longer reach. Ben and Sarah thought they could erase my history, rewrite it to suit their own selfish needs, but they failed to realize a fundamental truth. You do not get to write history. History, in the end, writes you. And its final verdict on their character was now a matter of public record. Looking out at the endless expanse of the city, I felt a sense of serene finality. The war was over. The legacy was secure. My story was not over. A new, vibrant chapter had just begun, and I was its sole author. I had taught my children one final, brutal history lesson. The most valuable things in life are the ones you cannot sell. And respect for the past is not a sentiment. It is a fortune.